So I wanted to start, this is sort of a strange place to start our conversation, Jnanavaca, but I wanted to start with, well, one of the things that's happened to me since I did the interview, I can't remember, it's about 2 weeks ago now, I've had quite a few emails from, a lot of appreciative emails, and I've had emails from people who also told me about their near-death experiences. So a friend of mine who's I know well and I trust what he says very much. He talks about being in an ambulance only a month ago with a heart attack and suddenly floating above himself and feeling great compassion for the medics trying to suddenly treat him. And I had other emails from friends of mine, people I've known quite well, about their near-death experiences. And I've also been talking to quite a few people about near-death experiences. But one of the things that's striking, and I thought might be the starting point for our conversation, is that people, and it sounds an odd place to start, but people are surprised by it. People are a bit kind of like, oh, wow, that was my experience. I've talked to quite a lot of people, especially people who are new to, looking at near-death experiences. And what you're getting, or I'm getting a lot of, is surprise, shock, pleasure, that made me wonder, why are we surprised? That's where I thought we'd start.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for asking me to have this conversation. I think I might have twisted your arm, but anyway, you agreed.
I can't remember who twisted whose arm.
Yeah. No, I don't know. I've got kind of two thoughts about that. One is that we don't tend to talk about death in our culture. Our wider culture, but even this Buddhist culture that we're both part of, Triratna, I don't know how much we talk about death and what happens after death. I mean, maybe that's changing. So maybe I shouldn't generalize about it, but I haven't heard too many people talk about what happens after death in these terms that, that Penny Satori is talking about so sort of confidently. And not just confidently, but in a very matter-of-fact way. There's something really delightful about the fact that she doesn't sort of mystify or obfuscate, or she's just very, very matter-of-fact about this is what she's observed time and again over years of doing research that she's done in an academically rigorous way, in a sort of respectable academic kind of way. So I think that's a bit new for us in our culture. But the other thought was that and this is again a sort of speculative thought. I don't know, but I just think that we live in a very, very nihilistic kind of culture. I mean, what I mean by that is that we live in a culture where the default assumption is that death will be the end. The death of the body is the end of everything, end of consciousness, etc. She says this, doesn't she, in her clip, that sort of materialist assumption is what most scientists have. I think it's possible that even in our Buddhist world, a lot of us have that underlying assumption. I mean, again, I'm speculating, I don't know. But it does seem to me that these sort of scientific assumptions go very, very deep. They're not always very conscious. So when somebody like Penny Satori comes along and says, tell you what, I've observed, I've got evidence that death isn't the end, it comes as a bit of a thrill and a bit of a shock. Frankly, in a certain sense, it shouldn't. If we were living in a traditional Buddhist culture, it wouldn't. Yeah.
I was struck there because you don't, when we talk about a nihilistic assumption, which is basically that, when you die, that's it, the end of consciousness, end of everything.
Yeah.
It always sounds rather grand, like you have this grand philosophical nihilistic position. Do you see what I mean? And you don't realise you've got an assumption. You tend to think, I think, that yes, death is the end, and that's just a fact. You don't think it's a belief. And it's only when you, see something like Penny talking, as you say, so straightforwardly and candidly and about people who have near-death experiences, you start to question that.
Perhaps. That's right. I think that's right. And of course, she's, as I say, from She's not a Buddhist, and sometimes it's lovely to have somebody who's not a Buddhist, who's coming from a very different discipline and worldview, concur with something that the Buddha taught 2,500 years ago. In fact, even before the Buddha, the culture in his time and before his time would have assumed that death wasn't the end. That's the culture that the Buddha grew up in, and in a way, he wasn't trying to make it. Buddhism's not trying to say, is it, that it's a good thing that we keep coming back.
Right, yeah. I thought as well, because you didn't grow up with that assumption either, did you? So I did. I mean, I was, I went on to the Church of England which never occurred to me it was a religion. I'm sorry if anyway, but it didn't really, And I think I very much had that assumption that death was the end. I didn't really believe in heaven.
Yeah.
But you grew up in a different culture.
Well, I grew up in a sort of Hindu culture, albeit in a very diluted kind of form, because I wasn't brought up sort of practicing Hinduism, and I was brought up in England. But yeah, nevertheless, the sort of basic assumption was that death wasn't the end, that consciousness was primary. Nobody would have told me that, not in so many words, but that was the kind of assumption. When people died, the sort of the rituals around celebrating death or marking death were always very explicit about helping the consciousness move on.
Right. Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? And the focus was always on that rather than on the sort of mourning of the bereaved. So when my dad died, I was quite young when he died, 11, and that was the sort of basic narrative. Yeah, that's how it sort of was, really. Yeah. And then for me, I mean, I won't sort of go on about this, but I was sort of interested in magic and the occult, and as a boy, this is, so when he died, I kind of thought, well, I didn't think great. I mean, I was bereaved and and shocked and distraught, but I also thought, okay, well, I'm going to now test whether there is something after death, because if there is, surely my dad would get in touch. Surely he would be willing to communicate. And in that rather sort of naive, simplistic way as a child can have, I started trying to communicate with him through a pack of playing cards that he used to play patience with these cards, so they were his. And I invented a sort of ritual around these cards, and then would ask him questions in my mind, and asked him to. The questions would always be a yes or a no kind of question to keep it simple. And then there would be a card for a yes and a card for a no. And one of the cards would reveal themselves as I sort of pushed some cards up. They'd fall and one card would come up top. Anyway, I got fairly consistent responses, enough to convince me that he was talking to me. I have not any memory of what I asked him. I don't know. They must have been really trivial questions.
How will I do at school? So this conversation is about the wisdom of near-death experiences.
Yeah.
One of the things that, the stories in Penny's book, The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, some of the stories are remarkable. Some of them actually touch into sort of miracle, where people seem to be healed of things that are not possible to be healed of. But I wondered what wisdom would we draw from near-death experiences, if you see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, as I say, I start from the premise that it's fairly uncontroversial that consciousness is primary. At least that's how it is for me. But the Buddha sort of started from that place, but then he was saying, no, there's much, much more than the fact that death isn't the end. Because so what, in a certain sense? What are we going to do about living if that's the case? So I was just thinking, well, the Buddha, what does he say? Yes, consciousness is primary,
So it's mind precedes world.
Mind precedes world.
Isn't it?
And I guess we've got to remember the Buddha didn't develop a whole metaphysics. He was reluctant to do that, reticent to do that. Later Buddhism does do that, but he did say that mind precedes world. Yeah. So that in a way, so consciousness is primary, but more than that, and I think this is really significant, is that what he was saying is that consciousness can develop. That we can develop our own consciousness. So consciousness has the potential to become richer, more expansive, more fulfilled, more empathic, more connected, more bright, more knowing of how things really are. It can grow, it can develop, and that you can do that deliberately, and you can do it yourself. I mean, it's not up to some creator God who you supplicate, or it's not up to chance. It's not that you just, that some people's consciousness is better or more developed than others, and that's a matter of chance.
Right, I see.
It's that there's deliberate method which the Buddha discovered that can lead to the growth and development of consciousness, and ultimately to how do you call it? A new type of consciousness. There's a goal there.
So you've got, consciousness is primary. Consciousness can grow, presumably, and become more conscious. Is that
maybe,
maybe, and that growth has got a direction.
Yeah,
it's got a direction to what tradition would call enlightenment, or even things like the unconditioned. Let's just, before we go on from that, because that's a set of steps already. What does consciousness is primary really mean? Because what does it mean? Here, it's all very well, but then I get on a tube, at the weekend, it doesn't feel like consciousness is primary when I'm on the tube, or it doesn't feel like it when I'm hungry. What is it? Because it sounds beautiful, but Penny says it in her interview, and I was really struck by, as you said, her sort of straightforwardness about that. But what does consciousness is primary actually come to mean about stuff?
Maybe we can explore that. Maybe there are different ways of thinking about that. But one way that seems relevant to what Penny is talking about, well, she's saying that the scientific kind of model has been that consciousness is a byproduct of the brain. Yeah. So you've got a body first. The brain develops in the womb and I guess after birth as well. And that consciousness somehow, mysteriously, and no scientific theory tells you how, manifests in the brain. But it's somehow just a byproduct of the brain. So when the brain dies, that's it. So that would be consciousness as a secondary phenomenon, as an emergent phenomenon in the brain. Whereas I think what Penny's sort of way of thinking is that no, consciousness precedes the birth of the body.
Because she says it's all around us, doesn't she?
And continues after the death of the body. So it's somehow more fundamental than the material body and the material world even. Another way of thinking about it is, Ian McGilchrist, in the interview that many people will have seen when I was interviewing him, was saying that he thought that this material world, that matter, was a phase of consciousness, or like a phase state of consciousness. Like ice is a state or a phase state of water, sort of solidified water, almost as if matter is a crystallized consciousness, is crystallized mind, is crystallized consciousness, and that everything to that degree is conscious to some degree or another. There's nothing inanimate. And certainly this is what Bhante Sangharakshita would say.
He would certainly say Bhante Sangha is the founder of our movement.
Yeah.
But surely that would, doesn't that, what would that say? Because consciousness is a funny word for that, is it? that,
Hmm.
Jnanavaca, the founder of our movement, said, he found it easy to think that, trees and mountains were alive, but he found it rather more difficult with plastic. This is, rather good example.
Although he does say, doesn't he, that even that is, he thinks it's his limitation, not the limitation of plastic.
Right.
I mean, when I studied physics, but a long time ago, actually, I mean, and I don't claim to remember my physics, and
you just have notes, haven't you?
Physics has moved on. I bought this, just as an aside, I yesterday bought a book by my physics tutor, Jeffrey Brooker, Dr. Brooker, who I remember from the 1980s. Anyway, he's written a book that is a sort of set of notes that he would have given me as one of his students. And I opened it on page 1 last night, very sort of nostalgically, hopefully. And I didn't understand the first sentence. I didn't understand anything at all. So my physics was very rusty. But I mean, what I was trying to study was science saying, look, matter can be analyzed into its smallest constituent parts. So you break matter down into atom or into molecules, and then atoms, and then subatomic particles. And that when you get to the smallest particles, that is what everything is. That is what everything's made of. Of course, what physics finds, what quantum physics is finding, is that when you do get down to that smallest level, that subatomic level, everything's so mysterious, it behaves so weirdly, that you can't even say that it's there when you're not looking at it. And the other thing that seems really strange is that the behavior of those subatomic particles seems to change depending on whether they're being looked at, depending on whether they're being observed. So suddenly, do you see that might hint at that even at that fundamental level, plastic is made up of these things, everything is, that there's some sort of, I don't know, responsiveness.
So why is it so difficult?
Awareness, responsiveness.
Yeah, but why is it so difficult to have any sense of that, do you think? Is it? I mean, it's interesting that Jnanavaca says it's his limitation, not plastics. Is that? Do you think that's? Why is it so difficult to have that sense?
It's so much easier when you're in nature, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, you can have that sense.
Even not just trees and plants, but mountains and rocks. And you can sort of have that sense a little bit more easily.
And again, Jnanavaca talks about to be a Buddhist, really, you need to be an animist first. Which is this sense, isn't it, that nature is alive. But let's go back to what. So we got this. We're trying to there explore a bit about consciousness is primary, because one of those things that you can sort of say fairly easily, and say, but hang on, I don't really get you. Then you're saying, and Bhante, Jnanavaca, and Buddhism is saying, is that the important thing about consciousness is because it can grow,
develop and grow in a direction.
In a direction which we would call towards enlightenment, or towards a new kind of being and consciousness that you can't really imagine. One of the things that's striking about the interview with Penny and with other interviews I've watched online of near-death experiences is quite often they meet people after death, relatives after death, who tell them that it's too early, they need to go back. And people have been very struck by this. Penny was telling like some stories which I didn't know, like one story where people go back and they're all this bunch of friends who have all died predeceased, this person, and they're all really angry with him, and so they're all saying, you shouldn't be here now, you should be here. And then another one goes up and meets her mother, her dead mother, and mother says, go back and look after your children. But in a way that becomes, do you see how that's then a sort of slightly imagined, well, that's great, that's what we're about. But I'm not sure that Buddhism would say that that's that great, coming back.
No, Buddhism would say, look, we've been here many, many times, maybe countless lifetimes. We've already done this. We've already done embodied existence again and again and again. And we haven't learned from it. Because each time we come back as an embodied being, human or otherwise, what do we do? We look for fulfillment particularly of the senses. And we assume that if we get what we want as a material being, pleasure, shelter and food and so on, which I know a lot of people, it's a luxury even now. But if we get what we want as a material being, that's the purpose of life. And then we die. And that's if we've lived a good life. I mean, we're all very aware of the horrors that are happening at the moment in Ukraine, and how so many people are in horrible, nightmarish, sort of unimaginable circumstances. A friend of mine here is Ukrainian, and his parents are out there. His parents are in a city that is currently being bombed right now, and they're having to take shelter in the hallway of their apartment because it's the only place that hasn't got windows. And unfortunately, they're on the ground floor of a high rise. So if the high rise is bombed, hopefully they can get out in time. But that's the sort of conversation I was having this afternoon with this friend of mine. And so life can be horrible and brutal and tragic. At its best, most of us think if we just get material success and the partner and the house and the holidays, then that's it. Buddhism would say, no, we've just done that again and again. Either we've had a horrible life or we've had a good life, but either way, it's not the main reason. It can't be why we're here. When my father died, as a kid, 11-year-old, maybe I was sort of precociously existentially kind of challenged, but it was obvious to me that life couldn't be about the mortgage and the car. We didn't have much money, but he'd managed to buy a car and a telephone and a fridge, one of those old telephones with...
You didn't know who was ringing you.
Yes, that's right. And I kind of knew that can't be what it's about. If you're going to suddenly drop dead, what are you doing? So Buddhism's, the Buddha wouldn't have said coming back is great unless you're going to do something with it.
It's striking, isn't it? Because it doesn't solve the question. Even if we take, nobody really knows about near-death experience, but even if we take them on completely on face value that you go, you meet people, they send you back, you still got this whole question about what is life then, haven't you?
Yes.
Okay, you have this life, and you die, and you come back, and you have another life. Soon in this series, we'll be talking to Carol Bowman, who is one of the first people in the US to research children with past life memories, because of course that comes into this discussion as well, which we'll be coming onto in the series. But so what would Buddhism say about that, coming back to life? Because the Buddha himself talked about the wheel of life, which was a re-becoming, assuming rebirth. What is life for still?
Sort of maybe not. Maybe we can work to that.
Yeah.
I'm struck. Well, as a sort of indirect answer to your question, I wonder. Like Penny Satori talks about how her research into near-death experience, she's convinced that they're real, as it were. They're not hallucinations from people with brains that are starved with oxygen or something. She's convinced that they're real experiences. And she's also saying that they're transformative experiences. And what's more, she's not had one of these experiences, but just researching them has transformed her life. And the way she talks about it is she's become less materialistic, and her values have changed. And I haven't read her book, I'm afraid, but I have read recently a book by somebody else who's done research into near-death experiences called Bruce Grayson, who's a doctor in, I think he's in Virginia, in North America, at the University of Virginia. And he again says that talking to patient after patient, maybe they're not patients, person after person who has these experiences, they have a transformative effect. And often what happens is people come back and they they change careers towards something more altruistic. They lose interest in material things. They lose a fear of death, which is incredible, isn't it? They, in a way, he says they lose a fear of life. They don't take life so, I was going to say seriously, but that could sound wrong. They don't take it as such a big, literal affair.
Sort of the be all and end all in a way.
As a be all and end all.
Yeah.
So, for example, Bruce Grayson asked some of his interviewees, what does he ask? He says, could it be that your experience was a hallucination, that it wasn't really real, that it was dreamlike? And what they say again and again is that no, what they experienced in their near-death experience was more real than this world, and that this world is dreamlike. And that's what gives them a sense that there's nothing to fear. Even death isn't to be feared. I think that's tremendously exciting and inspiring.
Because it implies that this world, that this life that we've got, that we're so attached to and so bound up in, that there's a realer version of it.
I don't know about a version of it, but there's something realer.
Right. More alive, presumably.
Maybe more alive.
More radiant. Sangharakshara again talks about, if you don't like the language of transcendence, you can just talk in terms of more life. And perhaps we're talking about a world of more life. Like we're going to be, you're going to be interviewing Ibn Alexander next year, and he had an experience which is like sort of a heaven world, which is like bursting with life.
Although Buddhism would also say, look, it could be. There are hell worlds as well, as heaven worlds. But I think what's significant for me is that it's trying to get my mind around that. Look, if death isn't the end, and if there are previous lives, then this, what I think of as my life, is only one link in a whole chain, of a stream of consciousness. And therefore, what I think of as important and significant might not be so important and significant if I could see the whole picture. The Buddha, on the brink of enlightenment, maybe as part of his enlightenment, saw his previous lives, it said. He saw countless previous births. And if I can't remember any previous lives, but if I imagine what that might be like, maybe I wouldn't take this life so seriously. I mean, in the wrong sort of way, it's not such a important matter, perhaps. Apart from, well, maybe I'll say something else about what Bruce Grayson was saying, Dr. Bruce Grayson. He's saying that people come back from these near-death experiences and they become more loving. It's as if they've seen, what have they seen? They've seen they've experienced some unconditional love. A lot of them talk about a love like they've never imagined before.
Sometimes, quite often embodied in a figure.
Sometimes embodied in a figure. That they've experienced this unconditional love and that they don't feel separate from it. And nor do they feel separate from all life, all beings. So they come back with that sense that that's what this life
is for.
Yeah.
And perhaps you could even, I don't know, could you say, that's what this life is for, learning to love. Keats calls the world this a veil of soul making, doesn't he? That it's where you learn things. And even some of the near-death experience, people talk about that this life is exactly the life you should have.
Well, again, I guess the Buddha didn't give a metaphysical sort of position on what this life was for.
Yeah.
What he did say is this life inextricably contains suffering and unsatisfactoriness, and that there's a way out of that, and that. Well, later Buddhism talks in terms of a precious opportunity, doesn't it? That being embodied, being human, having a consciousness that is capable of self-reflection and work, a consciousness that can develop itself, that gives you an incredible opportunity. And that's what this life is for, in a way, to use that opportunity to develop your mind, your consciousness. Ultimately, to realize something of that truth, that we're not really separate, that we're not, I mean, we're physically separate, and we take this physical world so literally. Even scientists, physicists take that physical world literally. And yet, from what I remember of physics, there's definitely an acknowledgement that, like, one of these tiny little particles, an electron, doesn't have boundaries. When it's not being observed, it's a wave of potential existence, of potential, I don't know, it's not even a thing. But that wave of potentiality is spread out across all of space. Yeah, it doesn't have a definite location. So we take this material world very literally. We assume that everything's solid because it appears that way to us. But that solidity, again, from a physicist's perspective, is an illusion. You know, most of matter is empty space. We just can't see that. We don't have the eyes for that.
I wonder whether we should come back as well to to this surprise that you feel when you and the people have been feeling watching this interview. Because we talked about our nihilistic assumption, but I wonder whether it might be better we have a sort of humanist assumption. Because nihilism does sound rather grand, and you can do a sort of chic nihilism. So, you think of it as people like Beckett and Brecht
wearing black,
wearing black and long coats, something chic, but going to see Beckett. What do you see? Nothing. What do you see over there? Nothing.
Yeah. I went through a phase of that,
Did
trying
you?
to read Sartre and
Well,
Camus,
we all do. And
wanting to be interesting at parties.
Yeah, but I wonder whether what we've got is more like a humanist view,
Yes.
a kind of secular humanist view, especially secular, that there is no, and Buddhism doesn't, I thought we might explore this a bit, that Buddhism doesn't have a god, so if you're not careful, you think, oh yeah, Buddhism is a kind of ancient kind of, a psychotherapeutic process or a...
Like Stoicism was or something.
Yeah, not something like that, something Greek,
Yeah. So I think that is the danger. Well, I mean, I'm talking in very grand terms, but I do think it's the danger for Western Buddhists and maybe Western Buddhism, is to secularize it all, is to turn it into a sort of flat, sort of flatten it all into a therapeutic system that works. Meditation is now shown by neuroscientists to have an effect on the structure of the brain, etc., etc. So it's respectable. And as Buddhism becomes more respectable, its danger is it gets assimilated into that secular humanist framework. That's what Nietzsche feared, wasn't it?
He called it European Buddhism, didn't he?
Did he? Yeah.
Yeah, that it would be like, it's a kind of new kind of nihilism, he thought it was.
Yeah. So if we're not careful, we'll sort of walk into that as, I think it's a trap. Why is it a trap?
I was just about to say,
why is it a trap? Because it doesn't mean, it doesn't then transcend death. I could live a thoroughly decent Buddhist life, but if I'm not really trying to go beyond this, if I'm not trying to ask the question of life and death, then all I'll be doing probably is working on just trying to be a slightly kinder, nicer, maybe more mindful man. Not that those things are bad. I could do with being more mindful. I could do with being, well, you live with me, so you know that.
I thought he was going to talk about me for a minute.
It's not a bad thing, but in a certain sense, I'm not interested. In a certain sense, I'm not interested. I was interested in what did happen to my father when he died, and the fact that I was still in communication with him. What's going on there? What does that say about life? And you have to have that sort of interest, that sort of inquiry for, I think, for consciousness to open up. Probably. I mean, I say probably because some people have spontaneous experiences and realizations. It's like consciousness wants to open up all the time. And we dampen it down. It's interesting that Penny talks about how the brain seems to, how did she put it?
Like a limiter valve.
And sort of filter it.
Yeah, filter, yeah.
And I think there's something to sort of use single inverted commas around wants. It's like consciousness wants to expand into its natural state, which is presumably boundless. That's what the Buddha taught.
Well, the Buddha said it was pure and radiant, didn't he?
And blissful.
Yeah.
So presumably some people will have that sort of visionary experience, either because of a near-death experience or, just in life. A friend of mine had it on a bus, on the top deck of a bus. But what Buddhism's saying is that you don't leave it to chance. You have a systematic path of practice that's more likely then to lead to those realizations, those experiences and those realizations. But if you're not trying to even move, if you haven't got that sort of in your sights, in your imagination, then probably one would settle for less, which would be a thoroughly conventional life with a bit more mindfulness and a bit more kindness. Not bad.
Not bad,
but sort of, so what? So, for example, I'm going back to the horrible war situation. I don't know, at its own level, there doesn't seem to be much of a solution at the moment, does there? I know you've got the whole world's politicians trying to put pressure on Russia, etc., etc. What am I trying to say? The Buddha said at its own level, samsara doesn't work. And there won't be a solution to suffering because the unenlightened mind is shot through with greed and hatred and delusion and will keep recreating pain.
We'll start to wind up in a moment, but I wanted to see if we can think about, you said that Buddhism can slip into secular humanism. I think that one of the issues for me in that is it's not always, you don't always realize that you have, and I think again, one of the reasons why the interview can be surprising is you really realize that you've slipped into a sort of standard assumption that you've basically just taken on from the group around you, that when you die, that is the end. I wonder whether there's any other, no, the dangers of Buddhism, but where Buddhism might, because the danger of this kind of conversation is that we host conversations and then we say, and of course the answer is Buddhism, in a rather trite way. And I wonder whether there's anything else that we should be careful of. And then I wanted to just finish perhaps by, again, coming back with compassion, because I wonder whether that, and what you're saying there about love, but...
Well, one danger that occurs to me, and in a way it's something that I feel in me I'm prone to, is a certain sort of complacency. So what I think if you practice Buddhism, you do tend to become more adept at making life work, and you will hopefully become generally more content and fulfilled, maybe even happier, although that's of course not part of the guarantee. But you will tend to be more, take things in your stride more, and be able to manage the ups and downs of life. And then the danger is, of course, that you settle for that, and you settle in a comfortable kind of complacent sort of way. Sangharakshita Bhante, our teacher, talks about, I think he talks about, you'll have to correct me, about a sort of refined selfishness, where, I'm fine, I've got my lovely meditation practice, my nice Buddhist friends, and my vegan food, cooked for me most nights of the week by my community members, and a certain sort of lack of concern for other people and for the suffering that there is in the world, the urgency of other people's suffering. If that, so I think there's a danger that we all sort of settle for a nice Buddhist lifestyle, including in our order. I'm afraid, Well, I feel it myself. I'll just speak for myself.
So let's sort of finish this part of the evening with, because I was thinking about this, coming back and feeling compassionate, and this thought in late Buddhism that you leave the world with wisdom and you come back with compassion, and that somehow that's what you're always trying to do, leave with wisdom and come back with compassion. And I wonder whether near-death experiences, and Penny's very, very straightforward account of them, starts to show you something of that. Of course you can't prove it. Of course we're out of that realm of proof and so forth. We're in suggestible. But there's something. It's striking, isn't it? So many of them come back with this sense of compassion. It really does feel like it echoes something in Buddhism about leaving the world with wisdom and coming back with compassion.
My aunt had a near-death experience some years ago, and she said that she was in this. I don't know how she'd describe it actually, but all those classic kind of ways that people in Penny's experience describe it. And she didn't want to come back. But she said she looked down at one point and her daughter was weeping, crying, and then that was enough to bring her back. Bante talks about his near-death experience, doesn't he? Where he says the scales were between life and death were completely evenly balanced, and then he thinks about the order.
Well, somebody asked him to come back.
Somebody asked him to come back. Right.
He was holding incense, wasn't he? And someone said, "Please don't die, Bante.
Right.
It's too early. We need you still."
And he said that it was like a hair's weight had been put onto one of the hands of the scale towards life. But maybe that's an echo of what the Buddhist tradition talks about, that you leave. By leaving, it doesn't mean a literal leaving. It means letting go of all attachment. So you leave attachment to this life, this body, all material things. You leave that attachment because you've seen consciousness is more than that. So somehow it's a disidentification. But then, having, as it were, become free of that attachment, you see that others are still attached and still clinging to something that isn't fully real. And you also, presumably, when you leave identification and consciousness expands to its true potential, you see that actually you're not really separate from all other beings. I'm sort of at the edge of, this is sort of what I imagine happens. And that sort of understanding, that's too weak a word, that realization of non-separateness at that level of mind, of consciousness, results in love, in compassion, in wanting to help everybody and all beings. And then that keeps you here in embodied form. And later Buddhism says that a bodhisattva would keep coming back. They'd be, as it were, keep playing this game of life. Most of us play the game of life wanting to win for ourselves, as if, if I get a happy life, I've won the game of life. A bodhisattva would be playing this game of life, I like to think, and their aim of the game is to help alleviate suffering for many beings as they can. But they would see it as a game.
Lila is the word.
Yes, it would be play. They wouldn't take it literally. almost like, I've never played a virtual reality game, but I suspect that that's what a virtual reality game would be like. You'd have a headset, wouldn't you? And you'd enter a world with an avatar, and you'd play this game, whatever the rules of the game were. Well, I think in a sense that's what we're in. But the headset is this physical body. So you can't take off the headset. Do you see what I mean? But an enlightened being wouldn't identify with the body. So then consciousness would be freed. Maybe.
Great. Well, that's a great place to pause for a moment. Thank you very much, Jnanavaca.